Hi, I'm Brian Forbes. Welcome to my Module 14 case study for EDL 850 School Law. So here's a quick summary of kind of the case study as an overall. In this particular scenario, we have a teacher who's in her second year of teaching. She's received an email that had a link to a Facebook post that has some not very nice things said about her, and a lot of negative comments about her personally, about her teaching style, her classroom management. And then also there's a threat at the end of it that said something along the lines of who would like to see this teacher disappear or go away, which that teacher took as a actual physical threat to her safety. So she reports this to the principal. The principal doesn't necessarily act in an overly serious manner with this. He kind of comes out and says that he thinks it's just a prank. And that judgment on his part is probably because he knows that this particular teacher over the last year and a half has received complaints about how stressed the students and families are that have kids in her classroom because she has such a very high rigor and she just doesn't seem to have very positive relationships with kids. So during this case study, we're going to look at a couple of different things. First, we're going to look at the problems that are outlined within the case study. We want to analyze the causes of those problems, so kind of dig deep into what those underlying factors are. And then we also want to offer some possible solutions to what we can do to help Mrs. Tate, to help this particular situation with a threatening email and Facebook post, and then also how can we help students so they don't make these same kinds of mistakes moving forward. So, excuse me. So problem identification here, there's a couple of things. First of all, we understand that there are three main people in this case study. The first is Miss Tate. Again, she's a second-year teacher in the school district. She teaches high-level science classes. She has a master's degree, and she prides herself on the rigor in her classroom, even at the cost of positive relationships for students. Now, Dr. Harvey Smith is the principal in the building. He's been there for quite a few years now. Just a few years ago, he actually won Principal of the Year, and he prides himself on only hiring the best staff possible, and so he kind of flaunts that to the community when he can. The third person involved in this case study is a student by the name of William Hall. This is a student who is squirrely in Miss Tate's class. She's never actually been able to identify that he's done something wrong, even though she claims that he's probably saying things about her, making fun of her behind her back when she turns around, but she's never been able to actually catch him in the act. So she can't say for certain that this is happening. It's possible that kids are laughing at him for doing other things as well. Again, we do know that Miss Tate does have some complaints against her in the past and that this has been an ongoing issue. And a part of that complaint process is the idea that Dr. Smith has made some recommendations to her, but hasn't really seen any outcomes that have shown improvement based on those suggestions, and she may not have even implemented those suggestions. We also know that the thing that kind of spurred all of this is the anonymous email that Miss Tate received that had a link that said you should read this, and so she goes to the link, and it's a Facebook page in which, again, Miss Tate is put down and has very negative things said about her, and then has that physical threat at the end. So some of the things we need to know or try and figure out as we move forward as an administrator would be who's responsible for all this. Do we put any blame at all on Ms. Tate's part for not having positive relationships? Do we not take that into account and say, okay, we just look at trying to find the guilty party of who made this Facebook page? Is it a student of ours or a parent? Is this even anybody that's associated with us? And then what do we do from there? Is this, should we have looked at this as an avoidable situation? If we would have provided Ms. Tate with more concrete professional development, would this have happened? If we had curriculum designed for digital citizenship and also social emotional standards built in, would these things have happened? And then, what are the appropriate reactions to this? Do we find the student who's responsible if it is a student? Do we suspend them? Do we turn them over to the authorities for the physical threat? What is the process in place for that? So basically, when we kind of take all of these factors and we put them together, we have an overall problem. We have the idea here that Mrs. Tate is basically being bullied through this Facebook post and possibly even physically threatened for her safety, all of which are going to be a huge problem, especially with all the things that have happened recently with school shootings, and bullying is always a hot topic, hot button issue in public schools. Also, Ms. Tate has less than ideal relationships with her students. All those complaints that she's had from students and families basically tells us, that she doesn't have positive relationships. Maybe she's not working to connect with students. She cares more about the instruction than she does the well-being of the kids. This kind of is an issue with FAPE because she's not giving students that free and appropriate, education. And so that's something that we would also want to consider. And then also the idea that we have Ms. Tate just making a blind accusation about a student here that she says some disparaging things about with his classroom behavior, and she connects that somehow to these physical threats, even though she says she has no proof of any of it. And that could be construed as defamation of character, so that's a real concern. And then I would also be afraid for Dr. Smith here, because the idea that he's not taking this very seriously, if he has knowledge of a physical threat and he doesn't do anything about it, and Ms. Tate shows up for work the next day, and William Hall, or any student for that matter, if someone else is responsible, injures Ms. Tate and he didn't do anything to prevent that, he could be sued for negligence. So we want to put together a plan of action then. If I'm an administrator, basically I want to break it down into three things as I move forward. The first one is always considering safety. That's my big thing, especially when I'm in charge of an entire building. So I want to look at the safety of Ms. Tate. I would not have her come in the next day while the investigation is happening, just to make sure that if anyone was meaning to do her harm, she wouldn't be there for that. I would also want to contact my school resource officer, letting them know that there was a threat made, to see if there could be an increased security presence in the building, or what kind of steps we could take to ensure that there's a physical presence on campus to help with safety issues. And then also I would contact my IT immediately. Dr. Smith suggests that he only contact IT if he finds that he needs to. I would definitely do it so that we could start moving forward on an investigation. So the next step is that investigation. I would want to find out who's responsible. Was it a student? Is that student William Hall? Is it another person? Then I would want to try and determine what was their cause. Like, was there an altercation between Ms. Tate and the person responsible? Was it a random act? Was it truly a prank, as Dr. Smith thinks it is? Or was the intent something more? Is it something more based on actual physical harm, someone who wishes to do Mrs. Tate harm? These are all important factors in trying to figure out what to do next. And then the last thing I want to make sure is that I implement things that are going to help aid not only in this situation, but in situations like this in the future. We want to be proactive instead of reactive. So one thing is to create policies that say what students are allowed to do with technology and what are going to be those clear consequences for breaking those acceptable uses. And some places do have those in the form of AUP policies. Another thing to look at would be a curriculum. We want to make sure that we are teaching 21st century digital skills to students in the classroom so they know how to use technology in a safe way, but we also want a curriculum that's designed around some social and emotional skills so they understand what are healthy ways to deal with conflicts. And then the last thing implementing is some professional development or plans of improvement for teachers like Ms. Tate moving forward. We don't want to just make blank suggestions to Ms. Tate about, oh, you can improve something about your classroom and then never follow up with her, because that's on us as much as it is on her if we're not ensuring that students are getting an appropriate education because of the classroom atmosphere. So we need to hold the teachers and the administration accountable for making sure those things are happening. So part of my solution here basically says that, I'm going to facilitate positive relationships with students. That's important, especially between students and teachers and their families. And that's going to all happen through promoting some ethical actions. The first is that in order to have teachers properly trained so that they can have classroom management skills and interpersonal relationships with students so that there's a trusting atmosphere so that students are going to want to participate, feel safe and comfortable so that they can get trust to ask for help and get aid, ask for extensions, or do whatever else they need to do in order to make good grades in that class. We also want to make sure that there's nonviolent resolutions for personal conflicts. Those conflicts can be between students and teachers. They could be between students and students, families and teachers, whatever the case may be. But we want to try and make sure that everyone understands there's other outlets than violence. And then the last thing is, again, that we want to make sure that there's an appropriate use for technology throughout the building. That includes teachers as well. but especially for students because they're at an impressionable age, and if they learn bad habits now, they're going to take those habits with them. And unfortunately, those habits can also include things like bullying and physical threats if they're not taught that these things aren't jokes. So reflecting on this case study, the first thing I was thinking about was the idea that, I can't really believe that Miss Tate made such a blank accusation against William Hall like that. Yeah, he might be a troubled kid, or he might cause some problems, or he's a class clown, but that's a huge jump from that to making physical threats to a teacher. So she might want to double think that, especially with the idea of defamation, but also just the idea that, you shouldn't ever jump to conclusions about somebody. The second thing is, my feelings. I felt two things throughout the case study. The first one is sorry for new teachers, because people like Miss Tate, it doesn't matter your level of education, whether it's a bachelor's or a master's. Being a new teacher is hard, and trying to find that right balance of, being a good guy or a bad guy, or having high rigor or positive relationships and where to meet in the middle can be tough. I also felt really disappointed towards Dr. Smith and the fact that he didn't take the situation more seriously. I just know if I was a principal and something happened to somebody and I knew something about it, whether I got sued or was found, guilty in some way, I just know that I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try and do everything I possibly could. Which leads to the third thing, which is I'm always valuing the safety of students and, the staff members and people in the building. That is my number one priority. Yes, we want them to learn, and I'm going to do everything I can to promote learning, but that's going to come in second to safety every time. The last thing here is that it's kind of something I thought was unresolved here, is that because we have Dr. Smith and his opinions about Ms. Tate, is he going to use this particular situation in order to, pile up, things in her personal file, reasons to get rid of her? I think that's unfortunate, especially when you have somebody with a master's degree that clearly knows what they're doing and has high rigor in the classroom. If we can just find ways to help her with some classroom management and then hold her and ourselves accountable to make sure that happens, I think she could be a really good teacher if we just find a way to make it happen together as a team. So here in Category 5, we looked at three things. One, how does the principal use integrity, fairness, and acts in an ethical manner? So I'm going to treat Mrs. Tate with equal concern, even though I think she has some shortcomings in her personal decisions or, the way she interacts with students and families. I'm not going to let that sway the idea that, she has a threat against her. I'm going to take it seriously. I'm also going to be fair towards the student, William Hall. Just because a teacher says something about him, I'm not going to go ahead and think that he's guilty just on the word of any person or individual. So I'm going to have a full investigation to figure that out. And then I'm going to act in an ethical manner here too, because even though this might be a prank, I want to make sure that I always choose the right thing to do, which in this case is have an investigation and contact all the necessary parties and then have interviews and set up the curriculum and set up professional development, do everything I needed to do. Even though that's more work for me, that's not necessarily doesn't make it the wrong thing. Like the right thing to do sometimes is often the harder thing. So I can break that down a little further and say here I acted with integrity because I always provide the same opportunities for professional development for my staff. So I'm not going to say, well, some teachers have been here longer or this teacher has better relationships with families or students, so I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt but not the other. So again, that also allows my personal opinions to stay out of this as well. So if I personally feel like someone's not doing a good job, or if I feel like, well, this is most likely a prank, I'm still going to act in a way in which I take it seriously. And then I don't allow outside opinions to cloud my judgment. So if Ms. Tate says something about a student, I'm not going to jump on board or vice versa. Another thing here is, again, acting with fairness. So 3 things I do there specifically is I investigate claims equally. It doesn't matter, if one person says they think the other person's guilty, again, don't jump to that conclusion, explore all avenues. I'm also not going to allow teachers to gossip. If I was Dr. Smith, I wouldn't have allowed Ms. Tate to say that. And I probably wouldn't even have asked her who I thought was the guilty party. And then also having that digital citizenship standards and emotional, social things mixed into the curriculum, professional development to make sure positive resolutions happen. And then I'm going to take action against the threats. I don't want that to, be taken lightly. I want to report instances to the authorities when acceptable, and I want to impress upon students, staff, and community their rights and responsibilities in these situations so that everybody's on the same page on what their expectations are. So All right, that's it. Thanks for watching my case study.